what I want to do. Connecting to the cloud server now. All right. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I'm very excited to introduce Professor Harry Compton. He's an environmental science professor, as many of you know. He began his studies at Camden County Community College before transferring to Stockton State College, where he received a degree in biology with a minor in physics. After gaining some work experience, he resumed his studies at the prestigious University of Pennsylvania, where he earned his master's degree in regional planning with a concentration in environmental engineering. After UPenn, Professor Compton spent the next 34 years working for the US EPA as part of a national and international environmental disaster response team, which was part of the Superfund mandate, which I don't think many people know that. His job was to investigate, design, and engineer sustainable solutions to hazmat releases. His work with the EPA took him to every US state and to 6 developing countries, which led to Professor Compton's love of traveling. So I'm pleased to introduce our featured speaker tonight, Professor Compton.
Thank you, Dr. Mackey, Professor Mackey. I appreciate everybody being here. And Lauren didn't mention that she goes to TCNJ, by the way. I wanted to just throw that out there. So she's a very proud student there. All right, so with that introduction, I want to move on here and just mention that most people think of EPA as, or people that work for EPA as bureaucrats, right? I mean, they push pencil, they push paper, they write rules and regulations and policies and impose a whole bunch of guidelines, and some are adopted by the states, some are not. But not every part of EPA is like that. There's actually people that actually do field work. They actually go out in the field, collect samples, soil, water, air, that kind of thing. So we did a lot of that when I worked for this team, and the biggest part of it was coming up, since it was a disaster response team, to come up very quickly with a solution to an immediate problem, whether it be a chemical fire at an industry or a chemical train wreck or whatever it was. We had to like think on our feet and come up with a solution right there. So that being said, and I'm with Professor Mackey, and when she first invited me to do this, I wasn't, she mentioned I've been to a couple of other developing countries, and I wasn't sure to talk whether I should talk about this Russian spill of spilled cyanide into the Dauga River in Latvia, which was a really interesting project. There was a businessman from Italy that left 10,000 drums of hazardous waste in a remote port in Nigeria. Or talking about a chemical weapons plant in Nukus, Uzbekistan, which was another interesting, really interesting project. Or some freak natural disaster that killed 1,700 people in Cameroon. So maybe at some point we'll talk about those. But today I'm going to talk about Sri Lanka and Haiti. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will be straightforward. All right. Hopefully you can see this. Are you seeing my slides?
Yeah. No, I'm not seeing it yet. Is anyone else?
All right. Hold on a second.
Is there a start share button at the somewhere?
I thought I pushed that. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Ah, that helps to hit start share. Share. Desktop 1. Share. Okay. Now I just need to get rid of this. this. Where's my slides?
A nice desktop, Harry.
Ah, and we better once I find this presentation. What did I put in here? What do I do with it? How about now? Are we seeing the presentation yet?
Yes.
Yeah, looks
Oh,
good.
awesome. Okay. All right. So I got sent to Haiti and Sri Lanka for two completely different reasons. So how did I get here, right? So EPA, this group that I work with at EPA that did the international response stuff, was connected to the State Department. And through the State Department, they would funnel environmental issues to either usually US Agency for International Development, or sometimes we work directly with the State Department, or sometimes it would be with an external organization like PAHO, Pan American Health Organization. And for Haiti, it was with the Panamanian Health Organization. So there was a ship called the Cayenne Sea that that had a whole bunch of Philadelphia municipal incinerator ash on it. It was probably the world's most notorious, one of the world's most notorious, most traveled, least wanted cargo ship full of waste. And in the late 1980s, there was a landfill crisis in the US. And so Philadelphia burns their trash. So they had all this municipal incinerator ash. They didn't have any room to put it. They contracted with this company, a little sketchy company, but nonetheless a company to get rid of this stuff. And they had a contract with a landfill in the Bahamas, and they were supposed to take it down to the Bahamas. So this was in 1986, right? So the Philadelphia contracted this firm, but when they got to the Bahamas, Bahamas rejected it. They didn't want it. And so that started the voyage of the doomed, or the damned, depending on how you look at it. So it traveled around the world, literally, trying to find a place to put this Philadelphia municipal incinerator ash. It kind of became a pariah, and environmental groups like Greenpeace followed it around and warned countries as it approached their ports and said, this stuff is toxic waste. Don't let them offload this stuff. And anyway, at some point it ended up, I think I have one. I want to talk about this in a second. Oh, here we are. So these are all the different countries. I saved a bunch of newspaper articles, and I was scanning the articles relevant to this talk. And you can see all the different countries that they tried to dispose of this stuff. Quite a few, right? And anyway, so they ended up in Haiti, in this little country, on this city called Gonaïves. Now, Gonaïves is one of the poorest urban areas, the poorest cities in the poorest country in our hemisphere. And there was a lot of political turmoil going on at the time. It was right before this gentleman, Aristide, became president. So they've never had a democratic election. So this was all happening at the same time. So this business kind of took advantage of the political turmoil and all these different groups vying for power in Haiti, one being the military, another being this really wealthy group. You may have heard of Papa Doc and Baby Doc Duvalier. They were the ones that were in control of the country up until this point. And So right around this time, uh, this priest won the election, but there was still a lot of political turmoil because shortly thereafter that he was deposed within like 9 months. I think it was deposed, but then he was reelected a year or so later, and it kind of went back and forth. So businesses like this cargo ship owner took advantage of all this political turmoil. So this is the ship, the Cayenne Sea, that traveled around the world trying to get rid of this waste. So I was there twice, actually. I was there once in 1988, right in the middle of all that political stuff, as at the request of PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization. And then I was there again in 1995 to reassess the waste at that time. Now, most of my pictures are from the 1995. Wasn't thinking about giving a presentation back in 1988. I was really focused on the problem at hand. And so most of the pictures were kind of boring pictures of dirt, which wouldn't be that interesting of a talk. So I did manage to have more slides when we were there in 95, but it'll still the same picture. So in 95, we were there with the UN. This was all during this political turmoil. There was so much political unrest. Now, this was before the earthquake, right? So well before the earthquake. And there was so much unrest there. The UN forces were there to keep the peace. And so they were worried about our safety. So we had to be under the protection of the UN forces when we were there. Now, this is a picture actually from our environmental science text. And it shows this great difference between Dominican Republic on the right and Haiti on the left. Now, Haiti has all these problems, right? So they have these political problems, and they also have these environmental issues. And one of the environmental issues is that they basically cut down a lot of the vegetation in Haiti, mostly for the purposes of charcoal. So there's a lot of barren hillsides, a lot of the topsoil's gone. So they have very little fertility. They have a high population, and they don't have an abundance of food, as it were, that they can grow, mostly because of this problem. And just by sheer coincidence, when I was there in 95, we were flying to the dump site where they dump this ash in Go-Naive, I was taking pictures of the shoreline, and I said, boy, there's an awful lot of runoff back then. You're not thinking 20 years later, I'd be teaching environmental science, talking about soil erosion. And when you cut down all the vegetation, all the soil runs off into the ocean. Just by sheer coincidence, I happened to, so I had these pictures, and you can see, it's pretty clear that when you cut vegetation and there's precipitation, all the topsoil and everything just runs off into the ocean. So then you have relatively infertile soils for growing crops. They even had barren hillsides. So most of it was for the uncontrolled production of charcoal. That's why they cut down a lot of the trees. So it made it extremely vulnerable to climatic events, let alone that earthquake that hit it. That certainly didn't help. So unfortunately, Haiti has a lot of issues, right? And the very last thing they need is some company dumping a bunch of toxic waste there. So this is Go-Naive. This is a very poor city in Haiti, but very large city, as you can see. And this is the dump site. So the Cayenne Sea parked here and dumped about 4,000 tons of this incinerator ash. They labeled it topsoil fertilizer. And then when Greenpeace warned the Haitian government, basically, now don't forget there was 15,000 tons on the ship. So they only dumped 4,000 here. But that 4,000 tons was enough to create a lot of problems. All right, so here I have a couple of pictures comparing what happened. So in 1988, that was right around the time it was dumped, and it was along that port, along this little spit right here is where they dumped it. And then they put a whole bunch of lime on top of it. So the picture on the right is from 1988. And you can see the lush mangrove here, right? So these are lush mangrove. This is 1995, what was it, 7 years later or so. And you can see that all that mangrove is gone. It's all dead and it's gone. Basically, I tried to take the exact same shot that we had from that way back when. And so this was definitely causing some problems. So underneath all this stuff is where that toxic ash is. And then another picture here just showing the mangrove that was really lush at one time was completely gone. Well, not completely gone, but almost gone. So we took samples, we collected samples, we worked with the Haitian government, some Haitian government representatives. And we dug down. So they dumped some of the ash here in this port. The other problem was right next to this port was this salt drying bed. So they had these massive drying beds here for salt. All right. So right next to this is where this toxic ash is being dumped. So there was a big concern that, during high water episodes that some of that toxic ash would end up over here. Now the ash was toxic mostly from lead and metals. That was the big problem there. It had a lot of lead, cadmium, that kind of thing that are pretty toxic. But they were in concentrations that were in about 1,000 to 1,500 parts per million. Now, normally, let's say here in the US, a normal cleanup level would be about 400 parts per million. So it was about 3 or 4 times higher than what we would allow in the US. And then they also put the ash in an upland site. And so the UN forces helped us out. They drove us up to the upland site where they deposited some of the ash. And but they got a flat tire, and I took this picture because it was kind of funny. But the UN guys were really awesome. They had a bunch of MREs, and they knew that most of the locals would appreciate food. So he was opening up his MRE, and we ended up giving him our MREs too, and then doling it out to make sure everybody there got some of the food there. Now MREs, as Robert will attest, is a pretty high calorie food. So there was probably plenty for these 6 or 7 children that were there. But the UN folks were awesome to work with. This is the upland repository. It doesn't look like much, but I just want to show the kind of desert-like conditions. Don't forget, this is a tropical island, but because a lot of the vegetation was cut down and loss of topsoil, almost looks desert-like. And they put these signs here. And the UN folks, the UN guys helped us collect some samples from this toxic ash site. And that's me. I just wanted to prove that, in fact, I did work collecting samples to do the analysis to show how toxic this material was. So Greenpeace, that report did its job. It made people aware of the fact that the US needs to take responsibility for this. Now, the city of Philadelphia at the time said, look, we did what we were supposed to do. We contracted with this guy. We were not responsible for that contractor that dumped it in Haiti. We don't want to be responsible for it. But there was enough pressure over the years. Now, it took a while, but there was enough pressure over the years, given our report that we put together showing the amount of lead and the fact that the US basically is dumping waste in a very poor developing country. It was just really bad press. So that applied a lot of pressure. So between Greenpeace and our report, there was a lot of pressure. At the time, there was a Mayor Rendell in Philadelphia, and I think it was around the year 2000. So this is, still going back a ways. It took quite a while, but finally, 16 years later, the ash ended up in Philadelphia. They dug it all up out of the ports, and they dug it up out of the upland area, and they brought it back to Philadelphia and put it in a landfill. So they finally took responsibility for it. And that's just a street vendor from there. Now the Cayenne Sea, the story doesn't end there. They dumped those 4,000 tons in Gonaive, but they traveled around the world to all those different countries. Or let me just go back real quick. For several years, and they changed the name of the ship. They repainted it. And sure enough, when they got back to the US, not only did the ship have a different name, but all the ash was gone. So what they had done was apparently just slowly dump the ash overboard in the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans over that time. So they finally put enough pressure on them for the city of Philadelphia. They worked with the New York City Waste Trade Commission, the State Department, and of course Haiti, to dig all this stuff up and take it back to Philadelphia. So that was Haiti. Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka was kind of interesting because that was actually my very first trip. So here I am, out of grad school, I joined this group in EPA in January of 1985. And I was kind of a newbie, as it were, and still getting my, the lay of the land on what my job was. And I loved traveling at the time. I really enjoyed traveling, but of course I didn't have any money. But here I am. I joined this group, and within a year, so this is actually December of that same year, I joined EPA, and they said we need somebody to go to Sri Lanka. Well, I had barely even heard of Sri Lanka, let alone go to Sri Lanka, halfway around the world, off the coast of India, and address this problem. They had a malathion fire there. Now, but malathion is a pesticide. All right, so now I did have some, I dug through my files and I actually found this old paperwork from the original request from the State Department asking us to go to Sri Lanka. So the first request was in December of 1985, and they asked us for some help with this malathion. There was a warehouse, and there was about, there was 1,300,000 pounds. I think it was worked out to be, I don't know, 600 tons or something like that of malathion that caught fire and burned. And so it really stunk. So this malathion stuff, being a pesticide, it's an organophosphate pesticide, but it also had a mercaptan in it. So when it caught fire, it really stunk to high heaven, like a really rancid, rotten egg odor. It smelled really bad. Now, the good news is, even though the smoke and everything is extremely toxic, the odor threshold, luckily, is extremely low. So you know to get the heck out of there. You would probably want to leave the area anyway because it really stunk so bad. But luckily, so the odor threshold is much, much lower than the toxicity threshold. So that turned out to be a good thing. So there was this major fire. We wrote to them. We wrote back to the State Department and funneled all the recommendations back to them. And they said, well, that's good, but we really want you to come here and help us out. We want, the problem is the firefighters didn't know what to do with this stuff. So they weren't sure how to put the fire out, and it ended up being a huge mess. And the thing is, the USAID, Agency for International Development, they donate and or sell pesticides and herbicides and other things to help out these developing countries. Now, for the most part, it's a very good thing that they provide these things because malaria is a huge problem there. In fact, there was a malaria hospital right next door to this warehouse. Probably not the best location for the warehouse, but nonetheless, so that's one thing that the USAID could have told the Sri Lankan folks that were managing this, that don't put the malathion warehouse next to a hospital. That would probably be a good thing. But nonetheless, that's where it was. The other thing is that we as the US don't tell developing countries how to handle this material. What happens if it gets into the drinking water supply? What happens if it gets into a wetland? What happens if it, it ends up somewhere that it shouldn't be? Or like this, what happens when it catches on fire? We really don't train them on these kinds of things. So that was where a lot of the issues were. So anyway, the second request was on the 10th of December. And so that's when we ended up going to Sri Lanka. I went with a colleague. All right, so our first stop is at the embassy. So here's the embassy in Sri Lanka. And so it was great because the embassy staff were phenomenal there. We worked with the USAID folks, and they gave us tons of information about the food, cautioned us on the food because the food there is extremely spicy. The language there, don't try and learn the language because of a very, very old language. They spoke Sinhalese, which comes from the 6th century BCE. So we probably weren't going to pick up any local dialect there or local language. Told us about the economy, how tourism was huge there. Tourism was very big, but they also they also grew rice and tea and lots of other products. And there was very good, very positive US relations. And then they gave us some information about the malathion fire and what the concerns were. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then what they would like us to do when we were there. And basically, it was basically the kind of thing that we would do in this country, where we would, go to the site, go over to the disaster area, do a relatively quick assessment, and come up with recommendations on how to get things under control, right? Get that chemical under control, keep it from migrating into the environment, keep it out of the groundwater, get it away from people, that kind of thing. All right, so 650 tons of malathion lost in the fire. Now, it turns out this organophosphate, and the reason I put phosphate there is because this malathion, it's a pesticide used to kill mosquitoes, had a fertilizer effect. So the farmers, it didn't take them long to figure out that if they applied this stuff to their fields, it would have a fertilizer effect and it would help their crops grow. So it turns out through this discussion with the State Department that there had been a number of thefts from this warehouse. And they believed, they weren't sure, but they believed that one farmer stole, collected, whatever, a lot of the malathion, which bear in mind is a liquid, took a whole lot of it. And then in order to cover their tracks, they torched the warehouse. Anyway, that's the belief. Because normally malathion is not flammable. But if you get it, it's normally non-combustible with a skunk-like odor. But if you get it hot enough, anything will burn, right? So they torched the warehouse. And then they wanted us to help dispose of the burned pesticide and the residue that was left there. So there's still a lot of pesticide there, an estimated 400 tons were left there. The stuff is soluble in water, highly toxic to birds, mammals, and fish. So don't forget, they get a lot of rainfall there. And so they were concerned about runoff, getting into the groundwater, getting into local wetlands. A lot of toxic gases and vapors, especially when this stuff is burned. phosphoric acid mist, carbon monoxide, extremely hazardous. So like I said, fortunately, this stuff has a very low odor threshold. So you know to get out of the area if you start smelling the skunk-like odor, this mercaptan, H2S. So this is, I just pulled this stock photo. This is what the malaria hospital looked like right next to the warehouse. And then this is the warehouse. This is the one remaining wall of the warehouse. And so what they did was, so everything is burned down, right? This used to have a roof and walls and everything. So they put the firemen didn't know how to put the fire out. So they dumped a whole bunch of sand on top of it, which is fine. That's helped put the fire out. They didn't want to put water on it. So that was actually pretty smart, because if they put water on it, then all of that burned malathion residue would end up in the groundwater, and that would be really bad. So they covered it up with these tarps. And like I said, it's predominantly a liquid. And now we have all the sand plus the malathion that's contaminated with this burned residue. Here's another shot of the warehouse, not much left of it. And so they really didn't know what to do. So we said, all right, the best thing you can do with this stuff is dig it all up and put it in an area that's flat that you can basically kind of land farm it. Basically, you're going to mix it with a lot of lime, and the lime will help control the odors and also help hydrolyze this material. So even when I worked at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the military facility, and we had to deal with nerve agents and those kinds of things, and malathion being a pesticide is kind of like a dilute nerve agent. That's what they would do. They would hydrolyze it with either a chlorinated or a really heavy concentrated lime material to help break the material down. Now, luckily, this has a relatively short half-life, so it hydrolyzes relatively quickly, but the Sri Lankan folks didn't have a good source of lime. So we checked out, part of our job was we went around with the Sri Lankan folks and looked and evaluated different areas. So sorry for the boring pictures, but don't forget, I wasn't really thinking about presentations at the time. These are just areas where we were gonna put that material to mix it with lime to see if it made sense. We were trying to come up with an easy solution for the Sri Lankan government. And just more shots of the same area. Now this looked like the best area because there were no residents nearby. It wasn't near a wetland. It was about 50 to 100 feet above groundwater, so not much leachate, if anything, would end up percolating down through the soil and contaminating groundwater. So this ended up being one of the best places. Plus, it was close to the warehouse. So you can see that's one of the walls of the warehouse. So this seemed like the most logical one. But they wanted to show us some other areas to give us other options too. So this is the second area they wanted us to evaluate, but this is largely a wetland kind of thing. So that probably would not be a good idea. And you can see how wet that wetland is. This is a young man riding on the back of a water buffalo, taking the herd through the wetland. So the area they wanted us to consider was like right here, just above grade. And I'm like, well, that probably would not be a good idea to kind of dispose of a bunch of toxic pesticide waste. And then the other area they wanted us to look at was this area, which would have been okay. It was high enough above groundwater and the wetlands weren't too bad, but all these residences here, they would be very, very unhappy once we started tilling or mixing that really stinky malathion pesticide. They would not be very happy at all. So here's just another picture of that area number 3. And you can see how some of these homes were actually pretty close. Nice looking homes, actually, some of them. All right, so this is my colleague here, and he's not the best GQ kind of dresser, but he is brilliant. This guy, Phil Campagna, he was the chemist that I traveled with. And he was just a brilliant chemist. And he's explaining to this Sri Lankan representative, how to handle this material and the best way to move it safely without people getting hurt. And so one of the areas that we looked at, oh, wait a minute, I think I got another one here. Okay. So lime, they needed to come up with a lime that we could mix with this malathion to hydrolyze it, to neutralize it basically as quickly as possible, also help control the odors. So we needed lots and lots and lots of lime. If they had 400 tons of material, plus all the sand that was also contaminated, we needed a lot of lime, but they didn't have this lime. Normally in the US, this would be easy. There's like limestone, calcium carbonate, or quicklime, calcium oxide, or cement dust, or hypochlorite, which is basically pool chlorine would have also worked on the job, but they didn't have any of this stuff. But they did have coconut charcoal. Well, that makes sense. And that would also work. So that was their solution. And that ended up being a good solution for hydrolyzing the malathion. And then we gave them advice about, be careful about moving the pile, because if you dig into that pile after it's hot enough to catch on fire, once you take those covers off and expose it to oxygen, it may reignite, right? So we cautioned them on how to proceed and gave them a whole bunch of steps on how to handle the material, being very careful with it. And then once they got to till the lime into the malathion at the repository. Now, one thing I want to tell you, there was a couple of the locations that we looked at had farm fields there, right? They were growing corn and all kinds of vegetables. Well, as Phil was talking to this Sri Lankan guy at one of the locations, I was looking down this row of corn that was growing, and there was like an alley there. And I looked down this row of corn. On the other end of it, about 50 yards away, I thought I saw a dinosaur. I swear to God, I thought it was a dinosaur. And I was absolutely stunned. It went by relatively quickly, and I thought I was imagining things. Am I going crazy? And then, so apparently what I saw was a water monitor, this giant lizard that grows anywhere from 8 to 10 feet. And I talked to the Sri Lanka guy, thinking he'd say I was crazy, but he said, yeah, they have a huge problem with these things because apparently they dig up all kinds of dead things and eat them. They will dig up a freshly buried human corpse and eat it. And he said, he was talking about it like it was, the way we might talk about nuisance deer or something, because they're eating all our vegetables, they're eating all our flowers. This guy was talking about these giant monitor lizards. So I knew I wasn't going crazy, but I thought it really took me aback to see this giant lizard. The other thing is the elephants are everywhere. They take care of their elephants. These are used a lot for construction. And to be sure, Sri Lanka was a beautiful, beautiful vacation island. So I just scanned this. This was actually a brochure from Sri Lanka, and it looks exactly like this. The people were incredibly friendly, gorgeous island, and apparently a lot of Europeans vacation there. So when we were at the hotel writing our report, it was just filled with French and German and English and anyway, people from mostly Europeans. It was kind of like their Caribbean, as it were. So there were a lot of Europeans vacationing there. And then, elephants just taking a bath. Like I said, they're highly respected. They take care of their elephants there. And then when we're driving around Colombo, the main city here, we noticed this guy in the storm drain in the middle of the city, like bathing. And at this point, he can't tell, but he's actually brushing his teeth. So good news, bad news, right? I mean, I'm glad he's brushing his teeth, but you might want to think a little bit more about where you're doing it, but it's all right. He's brushing his teeth. And then more shots of early in the morning in Colombo, the downtown business district. Oh, and this is another thing. So when Phil and I had some off time when we were walking around some parts of Colombo, these young folks would come running up to us. They'd have these baskets, right? These wicker baskets. And they'd come running up to us and they wanted to sell us a photo op. And this guy happened to have two cobras in there. You can see two snakes. And he'd like throw the thing down and whip up the lid and start, playing this little flute or whatever. And the cobra would come out. And anyway, there's more pictures of the downtown Colombo. Anyway, so that was my adventure in Haiti and in Sri Lanka. But everything got resolved in Haiti and in Sri Lanka. So they were pretty good projects because nobody died. Wish I could say that about all the projects I worked on. So any questions about either one of those projects?
Yes, actually, I had a question. Incidents like those, did they bring about more use of the MSDS, like material safety data sheets that we use over here? Was there any kind of litigation where countries got tired of us dumping everything or not knowing what we were giving them, and that usage kind of became more prevalent after?
MSDS sheets. I would like to think that after this episode, and we kind of talked to the folks at this embassy in Sri Lanka and coached them about that kind of thing, especially like around with the malaria hospital. And we, said it's probably not a good idea to have the warehouse right next to the malaria hospital. And so I would like to think that MSDS sheets, material safety data sheets, were they played a bigger role in this kind of thing, but I can't say for sure.
If you guys also want to ask questions in the chat, if you feel more comfortable doing that, I'll be looking at the chat. I did have one question. I was just curious how the US decided like which countries to help. Were we getting bad press, or was it our involvement, or can you just speak a little bit about how these projects were decided?
Yes, well, the Haiti project was definitely because EPA or the US was getting bad press because we were seen as this really rich country dumping waste in a really poor country, even though technically, it was all contracted and it was supposed to be addressed somewhere else, like in the Bahamas. But then, it was thanks to Greenpeace and our report, it kind of put a lot of pressure on the US, although it took a really, really long time to move that waste out of Go Naive back to the US. As far as Sri Lanka, no, they were very positive relations there. The Sri Lankans were thrilled that the US was there. They were thrilled that we were there helping out. They were thrilled that the USAID provided materials to them. They didn't see that as any kind of affront whatsoever. Haiti was a completely different story. So one was kind of a deliberate dumping, while the other was kind of a rescue, as it were, to help them out.
Any other questions?
Yeah, hi, Professor. Many other countries bought our waste because our landfills were running out of space. I think they stopped that several years ago. Are there any other problems with the similar situation to the Cayenne Sea, where, like China, I think, used to buy a lot of our garbage? Could you address that?
So Yeah, we went through this landfill crisis in the 80s, and then we started recycling, doing a lot better job with recycling. And then China helped us out with that. But then they withdrew, and now they don't take any of our recycling. So I think we're going to have the same kind of landfill problems because we aren't putting less in our landfills now than we did before. We're putting more than ever. And it's hard to, nobody wants a landfill in their backyard, right? Not my backyard syndrome, the NIMBY syndrome. So it's only a matter of time before we're going to have this issue once again. And I think this happens a lot more. We're only aware of it because Greenpeace daylighted it, really, as far as the Cayenne Sea. But I think it goes on a lot more than people are willing to talk about, where stuff ends up on ships and then ends up like in the oceans. Like most of that material, most of that toxic ash just ended up getting dumped in the oceans, which is kind of unfortunate.
Yeah, one more question, Professor. Did the company get sued that did all that dumping, or did they just go bankrupt and I guess it became a super fund kind of a thing, or maybe?
Oh, the company itself, the contracting, yeah, they went to jail.
Oh, okay, good.
Oh yeah, no, they got them. They went to jail.
Thank you.
So I see some comments in the chat. Sheila had commented that it's interesting how the economy is so closely linked to environmental protection issues. And then Mary Jo Burkhard said she saw on the map that Cabo Verde of the ports where the ship dumped waste, did they deny them?
Yeah, every other country, every other location on that map, they denied. Greenpeace got out in front and warned the country not to take the stuff, even though they're trying to sell it as a fertilizer.
That's crazy.
They just took advantage, that's why I put that political stuff in there in Haiti and all the other issues that they have there, because they just took advantage of that political turmoil time where there wasn't any clear leadership in the government, and they just took advantage of that and dumped the waste there. If there was a clear leadership paradigm, as it were, in Haiti, I don't think that would have happened.
Right.
Yes. Hi, Sheila.
Hi. When you say they went to jail, who is they?
Oh, the contractor.
The workers or the CEO or?
Oh no, they had I had the names of the guy that ran. He was the contractor that had the ship, the cargo ship. He went to jail. I don't know how long he went to jail, but they did arrest him and put him in jail, and mostly for dumping the waste in the ocean, then as well as Haiti.
Yeah. But I just can't help but wonder. I'm sorry, I don't mean to get all super political, but I can't help but wonder if the people who were ultimately financially responsible for that, walked. And it was the middle management who is, tried and convicted.
Yeah. Well, I can't explain.
So I wanted to.
Well, do something about it, Kelsey.
I can only, I handle the waste. You give me environmental waste problem, I'll give you a solution. As far as all that other intrigue, I don't have a silver bullet for that.
I guess it was a good 6-1, half a dozen the other. We couldn't get rid of it to foreign countries, but it ended up back in our backyard in Philadelphia, all that toxic waste, which I guess they must have treated and disposed of eventually in some kind of safe fashion.
Yes. Yeah. Well, hopefully. It was already municipal incinerator ash, so it was already burned, and they probably just dumped it in the landfill. I was just glad they went back to Haiti and retrieved it and brought it back to Philadelphia. To be honest, I never in my wildest dreams thought they would ever do that, but they did. So that was a good thing. They came up with the money and found a way to bring it back. Of course,
During
there's
your
still 15,000 tons dumped in the ocean. But
during your time in the EPA, would you say other countries you worked with, how were their safety standards compared to the US, and did they scale up appropriately over your time where they kind of caught up to where we were or just knew more about what they were dealing with?
yeah, to some degree, that is absolutely true. A lot of the countries that we went to were countries that didn't really have a well laid out environmental program, as it were, or even environmental laws per se. I mean, they may have had some, but not anywhere near to the sophistication that we do. So there were definitely gaps in their legal construct, as it were. And I'm sure that they filled those gaps, during or after we left to address that kind of thing.
So I just wanted to share a few things in the chat. Gavin had shared that he read Nervous Conditions for the world literature class, and the other reading group was a novel called Funny Boy. They addressed issues in Sri Lanka, more of political issues, but the environmental issues were very interesting, a great connection to the political issues. So that was a nice insight. Thanks, Gavin, for that. And then Justin had a question. He wrote, due to the landfills being filled up and space running out to keep, do you see us resorting more to incinerating garbage? What's going to happen when we run out of space?
Wow, now that's $1 million question. Yeah, incineration actually works very well. It's extremely effective, but people don't trust it. We used to, when I first started at EPA, a lot of our really nasty problems, the solution was just to burn that waste, especially if it was an organic waste, whether it be trash or chemicals or whatever. If it was organic, stick it in the incinerator and burn it, because it works. It's very effective. It works, eliminates the problem. You're done with it. But the problem is, one is expensive, and the other is that people don't trust. We found more and more that the public did not trust that the noxious fumes and odors and particulates and other things from the incineration were safe. And the more we tried to present incineration as a solution, the more it was rejected by the public. They wanted something else. So yeah, but incineration could be very effective. If you burn a high enough temperature, you can just reduce it to, ash, to just elements, as it were. And Robert, were you in the Navy by any chance?
I was Air Force.
Oh, Air Force. All right. Well, the Navy actually has these incinerators on their ships that are really incredibly efficient. And they reduce everything, all the trash, because they can't dump the trash overboard and it accumulates there. So on these giant aircraft carriers and those kinds of things, they have these massive incinerators, and they reduce this stuff, and so subsequently it contracts the volume of the waste down to almost nothing, but they burn at a super hot temperature. So it can be done, and I don't know if that's going to be the solution. I still think we need to find a better way to do a better job at recycling, or coming up with that circular economy, so we incentivize people to buy recycled products. And that's part of the problem too in our country, is that we don't incentivize anybody to buy recycled products. Everybody wants everything brand new.
Yeah, and I often think, the reduce, reuse, recycle, like it is, the highest one is reduce. Like that's what you should do first. And then reuse if you have it. And then last resort, recycle. Like recycling, it's really for, aluminum, it's efficient, but for glass and for plastics, it's not necessarily, this wonderful solution all the time.
No, but glass used to be. Remember, we used to recycle all kinds, or at least reuse to a large extent, glass all the time. But now even that's going away. Now people don't even want glass anymore.
Yeah.
Now it's just number ones and number two plastics. So there are companies out there that are doing that, like TerraCycle out here in Trenton, where I live, making products. But there, like I said, there's no incentivizing, as it were, of their products.
I have a question about incineration. I grew up in New Mexico, and we always had incinerators, but we had problems with, this may not, this is old, I'm old, but this may not even be an issue anymore, but we always had problems with air scrubbers. And the EPA, you may have been one of the people who was there, was constantly, the EPA was constantly being called in to evaluate how much pollution was going into the air. And the areas where we had incinerators in outside of Albuquerque were just gray. Is that still a problem, or has that been corrected?
I don't know about that particular problem, but EPA, here's the problem with incineration that's in effect. All right, so if you have a company that has an incinerator, all right, let's say it's really efficient, and then for whatever reason they want to save money and they burn at a slightly lower temperature. If you don't burn at a high enough temperature, you end up generating dioxins, and dioxins are a pretty toxic thing, and that's what a lot of the EPA monitoring was for, probably. And that incinerator that you were talking about was for the dioxins in particular, because the scrubbers themselves would actually take out the acid portion of it, like the nitric acid, sulfuric acid, and neutralize those things. That's what they were really designed for. But the big concern was dioxins, and that's why there was a big pushback from the public for incineration, because dioxins are persistent. If they end up in the smoke or the exhaust, they are extremely persistent in the environment, and they're extremely toxic. So that's why you have to burn. Incineration only works if you burn a really, really high temperature and you actually burn, the dioxin is no longer there. And people just didn't trust, there was just no public trust anymore with incineration. I think that was a big part of it, that there was no, they just didn't have that public, that trust that they were going to burn at a high enough temperature so there wouldn't be a problem.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm talking and I'm on mute, I'm sorry.
So there were a lot of comments in the chat thanking you, Professor Compton, and saying that it was a great presentation and we learned a lot. And I really liked the photos, the authentic like 80s and 90s photos. That was pretty awesome.
I got a scanner and it took me a while, as Ricky and Lauren will attest. I'm a little bit challenged with IT stuff, but so it took me a while to figure out how to use a scanner and try and but I have all these things that I saved and I wanted to, so I'm glad I had this. You kind of twisted my arm to get this, to force me to learn and put it together. So yeah.
Well, thank you as always for participating and for, sharing your expertise with all of us. It's definitely, we've had a lot of experience and we all benefit from that. So thank you very much, Professor Compton. Round of applause. I got to get my reactions. Oh, there we go. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for the opportunity.
If you have any questions, or we do have another event tomorrow at during college hour, which is I believe 11:45 it's starting at. Ashley Zampogna Krug is going to talk about the environmental impact of a border wall, and she is an immigration scholar. She's been researching the environmental impact of the border wall. So, so that should be a great presentation as well. But thank you all for coming, and especially thank you to you, Professor Compton, for sharing sharing stories of your travels and all that you encountered. We really appreciate it.
Okay, I'm thrilled to do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
See you tomorrow, Robert.